November 3rd, 1980, Johnny Carson was in the middle of a light-hearted interview with Jack Lemmon when Lemmon suddenly said 7 words that brought everything to a halt. "Johnny, I need to tell you something." What followed became one of the most emotional moments in The Tonight Show's history. That Monday evening, the show had been running smoothly. Johnny Carson was chatting with Jack Lemmon, one of Hollywood's most respected actors and a frequent guest. At 55, Lemmon was at the peak of his career, fresh from the success of The China Syndrome and preparing to promote his upcoming comedy. The interview began with the easy warmth and humor that defined Johnny and Jack's long friendship. They had known each other for years, and their on-screen rapport came naturally. Jack entertained the audience with his famous impressions and shared behind-the-scenes stories about working with Billy Wilder and Walter Matthau. The studio crowd loved every moment. Johnny skillfully set up lines for Jack's punchy comebacks, and everything was unfolding exactly as planned. But about 12 minutes into the segment, something changed in Jack Lemmon's expression, something Johnny immediately picked up on. He had just asked Jack about his upcoming projects when Lemmon's smile began to fade. The legendary actor, admired for his sharp comedic instincts and effortless transitions between humor and drama, suddenly appeared unguarded, showing a vulnerability the audience had never witnessed before. "Johnny," Jack began, his voice noticeably softer than before, "before we discuss the new film, there's something I need to say to you and to America." The audience, sensing a sudden change in tone, fell silent. Johnny leaned forward slightly, his instincts as a host telling him that something meaningful was about to unfold. "Of course, Jack," Johnny replied calmly. "Whatever you need to say." Jack Lemmon took a deep breath, glanced at the camera, then back at Johnny. "I went to the doctor last Tuesday for what I thought was just a regular checkup. I'd been feeling tired and having some pain I couldn't quite explain. I assumed it was just age catching up with me, 55 years of it," he said with a faint smile. Johnny's expression grew serious. "What did they find, Jack?" "They found cancer," Lemmon answered quietly but firmly. "Colon cancer, stage 2. For a few seconds, Johnny Carson sat motionless, processing the words. Then, without hesitation, he did something that showed why he was known for more than his humor. He became the friend Jack needed in that moment. Johnny rose from his desk, walked over, and placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything. "Jack," Johnny said, his voice low and steady, "thank you for sharing this with us. I know that couldn't have been easy, especially in front of millions of viewers." "I wanted to say it here," Jack replied. "This show has always felt like talking to friends. If I was going to tell people, I wanted to do it somewhere that felt safe." Johnny returned to his seat, but the atmosphere in the studio had completely changed. The audience sat in respectful silence, aware that they were witnessing something deeply personal, far beyond entertainment. "Can you tell us what comes next?" Johnny asked gently. "If you're comfortable sharing, of course," Jack nodded. "I have surgery scheduled for next Monday. They'll remove the tumor and check if it's spread to the lymph nodes. The doctors are optimistic since it was found fairly early, but with cancer there are never any guarantees." "Are you scared?" Johnny asked, showing the kind of straightforward honesty few interviewers would dare in a moment like that. "Terrified," Jack replied without hesitation. "I've played many characters facing crises, but this is real life. And it's completely different when you're not acting. I have a wife, kids, friends, people I'm not ready to leave. And there's still so much I want to do." Johnny leaned forward, his usual humor replaced by sincerity. "You're going to beat this, Jack. You're one of the strongest people I know, and you've got the best doctors out there. But more than that, I want you to know you're not alone. Whatever you need, support, distraction, someone to talk to at 3 a.m., I'm here. We're all here." What happened next surprised everyone. A woman in the third row raised her hand and called out to the stage. "Mr. Lemmon, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to ask you something." Security began to approach, but Johnny gestured for them to stop. "It's all right," he said. "Go ahead." "My husband was diagnosed with cancer 6 months ago," the woman said, her voice trembling. "He's been too afraid to talk about it with anyone." "How did you find the courage to tell people? How do you deal with the fear?" Jack looked at her with empathy. "You deal with it by not dealing with it alone," he said. "That's why I'm talking about it now. I spent the last 5 days keeping this to myself, trying to act strong, pretending everything was fine, and it was exhausting. Hiding it was harder than facing it. So I decided I wouldn't hide anymore. In that moment, Johnny made a spontaneous decision that changed the tone of the entire show. He signaled to Fred de Cordova to extend the segment and turned to the audience. Is there anyone else here who's been affected by cancer, personally or through someone you love? Nearly a quarter of the audience raised their hands. For the next 15 minutes, The Tonight Show became something entirely different. A space for openness, for honest conversation about fear, hope, and survival. Johnny guided a heartfelt discussion between Jack and several audience members. A young woman spoke about losing her mother to breast cancer. An older man shared his experience surviving prostate cancer. And a teenage girl asked Jack how she could best support her father as he went through chemotherapy. Jack Lemmon answered every question with honesty and compassion, sometimes through tears, other times with the dry humor that people facing serious illness often use to cope. Johnny Carson, known for his sharp timing and comedic skill, understood perfectly when to speak and when to simply let silence carry the weight of the moment. You know what I've realized while talking about this? Jack said at one point. Cancer doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, famous or not, young or old. That's terrifying, but it's also oddly comforting, because it reminds us that we're all in this together. As the segment neared its end, Johnny made a promise to Jack Lemmon, one he would keep for the rest of Jack's life. Jack, Johnny said, you're not going through this alone. I'll be checking in on you every week, not as a host, but as a friend. And when you've beaten this, I want you back here to tell America how you did it. Jack smiled through misty eyes. It's a deal, Johnny. And thank you, not just for letting me talk about this, but for showing people that it's okay to be scared, and it's okay to ask for help. That's what friends are for, Johnny replied simply. When The Tonight Show ended that night, NBC's switchboard was overwhelmed with calls. But unlike the usual flood of comments about celebrity guests or comedy bits, these messages were different. Viewers called to share their own cancer experiences, to thank Jack for his openness, and to ask how they could contribute to cancer research. The American Cancer Society later reported that in the 24 hours following the broadcast, they received more calls than they had during the entire previous month. People who had hidden their diagnoses found the courage to speak openly, and families who had avoided painful topics finally began to talk. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, an oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, later reflected, what Jack Lemmon did that night probably saved lives. Early detection plays a vital role in treating cancer. When Jack Lemmon spoke openly about his diagnosis on national television, thousands of viewers who had been delaying medical checkups suddenly scheduled appointments. What most people didn't see, however, was the depth of Johnny Carson's personal support for Jack during his treatment. True to his promise, Johnny called Jack every week, sometimes even more often. He visited him in the hospital after surgery, bringing books, jokes, and a sense of normalcy to the sterile environment. During Jack's chemotherapy, when he was unable to work, Johnny quietly ensured that his friend's family had everything they needed. And when Jack was strong enough for company but too weak to go out, Johnny would bring dinner over, and the two would spend evenings watching old movies together. Johnny never made me feel like I was sick, Jack later said. 4 months later, in March 1981, Jack Lemmon returned to The Tonight Show. His surgery had been successful, and the cancer had been caught before spreading too far. He was officially in remission. When Johnny introduced him, the audience erupted into a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. Jack walked on stage looking thinner but healthy, and the first thing he did was embrace Johnny Carson. Well, Johnny said with a grin once they sat down, you kept your promise. I told you I'd beat it, Jack replied with his familiar smile. Though I'll admit there were moments when I wasn't sure I would. What got you through those moments? Johnny asked. Honestly, Jack said. This conversation we had back in November. Jack explained that what kept him strong was knowing he had spoken about his diagnosis publicly, that he had made an unspoken promise to everyone watching to keep fighting. It gave me something to hold on to when things got difficult, he said. During that return appearance, Jack also shared something else. He had received thousands of letters from people affected by cancer, patients in treatment, families supporting loved ones, and survivors offering encouragement. Reading those letters reminded me that I wasn't alone, Jack said. None of us are. Jack Lemmon went on to live another 21 years after that diagnosis, continuing his work and even earning another Academy Award nomination. When he passed away in 2001, it was due to complications from bladder cancer, a separate illness that developed many years later. But he always credited his earlier recovery from colon cancer to early detection and the network of support that had grown from that Tonight Show conversation. In his posthumously published autobiography, Jack devoted an entire chapter to that November evening. "Johnny Carson gave me permission to be vulnerable," he wrote. "In a world where men are taught to be strong and silent, Johnny showed me, and millions of others, that real strength lies in admitting you're afraid." That conversation saved my life in more ways than one. Jack Lemmon's candid revelation on The Tonight Show became a pivotal moment in how Americans discussed serious illness. Before that, cancer was rarely spoken about publicly. People kept their diagnoses private, endured treatment in silence, and faced their fears alone. But Jack's openness, along with Johnny's empathy, helped change that culture. Afterward, more public figures began talking about their health battles. Families found it easier to discuss difficult topics, and the stigma surrounding cancer began to fade. Cancer organizations later recognized that Tonight Show episode as a turning point for public awareness and fundraising. Jack's honesty, and Johnny's calm, respectful response, made the subject of cancer something that could finally be spoken about openly, without shame. Years later, when asked about the most meaningful moment of his career, Johnny Carson always pointed to that conversation with Jack Lemmon. "I did thousands of interviews over 3 decades, Johnny said in a 1999 interview. "I talked to presidents, movie stars, comedians, and everyone in between. But the most important conversation I ever had was with Jack that November night, because it wasn't about show business. It was about life, death, friendship, and courage." Today, cancer counselors and medical professionals often use that Tonight Show clip as an example of true compassion, demonstrating how to listen, ask honest questions, and create space for someone to be vulnerable. Johnny Carson paused his show that night not because something went wrong, but because something profoundly right was happening. A friend needed support and he offered it, showing millions that the most powerful thing we can do for someone facing illness is to be there with honesty, empathy, and unwavering friendship. If this remarkable story of courage and connection inspired you, consider subscribing for more true stories about moments when television brought out the best in humanity. Share this video with someone going through a health challenge and remind them they're not alone. And if you've been postponing that doctor's visit, let Jack Lemmon's story encourage you to take care of yourself today.